Today we are looking at a case from the end of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to England. Frances Coles was born on the 17th of September 1859 in Bermondsey, a densely populated and predominantly working-class district in South London. Her family came from humble beginnings and had limited financial security. Her father, William James Coles, was originally from Publow in Somerset and had come to London to seek better work opportunities. He was a shoemaker, a trade that, while skilled, often only offered a meagre income. Frances's mother was named Mary Ann, and she was originally from the town of Armagh in Ireland. Like many children in Victorian Britain, Frances grew up in economic hardship. She had few luxuries and limited prospects for advancement. Schooling for poor children in the 1860s was often minimal and inconsistent. Many children from working-class families had limited access to formal education, as families prioritised immediate income over education. When schools were available, they were typically overcrowded, poorly funded, and offered a basic curriculum focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. These schools were often run by charitable organisations or church missions, aiming to provide the basics of literacy and morality to children who would otherwise have no education. There were few resources like books or proper supplies, and teachers were frequently untrained and underpaid. School attendance was often irregular and interrupted by the need to work and contribute to the family's income. Growing up, Frances's parents struggled to make ends meet, facing the added challenges of poverty and disease, common hardships during Victorian Britain. Eventually, the family moved to White Lion Court, an area in Bermondsey known as the Leather District because of its busy leather industries. Even with the move and Mr. William Cole's efforts to give his family a better life, their situation barely improved. They still faced cramped housing and poor sanitation and struggled with the tough realities of working-class life in late 19th century London. In 1880, at the age of just 21, Frances left the family home. She found work as a saleswoman at a wholesale pharmacy in the Minories, an area of London north of the River Thames. Despite the potential for steady work, she frequently confided in her elder sister, named Mary Ann, about the physical strain that the job placed on her. The repetitive task of corking and uncorking bottles left her hands and her knuckles sore, a frustration that she couldn't endure for long. Though she had hoped that the position would offer her some stability, she gave it up and decided to seek a different path. However, life did not improve for her, and by 1883, at the age of 24, Frances turned to the streets to gain her income, a decision born out of necessity rather than choice. She was known to be an attractive woman, and she quickly gained popularity among the local men who sought her services. Though this new life was harsh and demanding, for a time, it seemed to her that it was the only way that she was able to support herself. Frances desperately tried to hide her financial predicament from her family, especially the truth about her fall from grace and her life working on the streets. She wanted to shield her parents, particularly her father, from the harsh reality of her situation. However, on the 26th of December 1890, she visited her sister Mary Ann for tea, but she was guarded and carefully maintained the illusion that she was living a more respectable life. She claimed to be residing with an elderly woman who lived near the commercial road, and that she was still working at the wholesale pharmacy in the Minories. But Mary Ann noticed something was wrong. Frances looked poor, unkempt, and even seemed to smell faintly of alcohol. She wondered what her sister might be hiding. In 1891, Frances's father, James Coles, had become quite frail and was residing at the Bermondsey Workhouse on Tanner Street. Despite her own hardships, she made every effort to visit regularly, often attending church with him on Sundays. Although James was in poor health, he was not naive and had grown concerned about his daughter's well-being. He would always ask her how she was, and she would reply that she was fine and tell him not to worry. But on Friday, the 6th of February, she eventually opened up and admitted that she had left her job at the pharmacy. However, she reassured him that she was well and still living near the commercial road. But in fact, all she was doing was carefully trying to mask the harsh reality of her situation. On Wednesday, the 11th of February 1891, a 53-year-old man named James Sadler, who worked as a merchant seaman and fireman on the SS Fez, had been given time off from his ship. Wanting to make the most of his leave, he went to a few alehouses and eventually arrived at the Princess Alice pub. Miss Frances Coles was there, a woman known to Mr. Sadler, as he had once been a regular client of hers. They started talking, and after a while they left together and made their way to Spitalfields Chambers, which was a popular lodging house on White's Row. They then spent the night there. The next day, Frances stayed with James, and they went out drinking together. That evening, the 12th of February, Frances visited a millinery shop on Nottingham Street in Bethnal Green, where she bought a new black hat with the money that Mr. Sadler had given her. The shopkeeper, named Peter Hawkes, noticed that the woman in his store seemed to be quite drunk. Nevertheless, he still sold her the hat. An hour or so later, at 9 p.m, Frances and James were seen having an argument. He said that he had been robbed, but Frances seemed unconcerned and refused to give him any money. Mr. Sadler was quite displeased and wandered off. By 11:30 p.m, Frances had returned to Spitalfield Chambers, visibly intoxicated. She found a spot on a bench in the kitchen, leaned her head down on her arms, and quickly drifted off to sleep. Not long after, James Sadler stumbled back to the lodging house, but he was not in a good way. He was battered and bruised, and quite upset. Apparently he had been denied entry back onto his ship, the SS Fez, and had become embroiled in a series of drunken confrontations. The night watchman, Charles Gouvet, seemed to feel a bit sorry for James Sadler and, concerned about his condition, helped him clean up his bloodied face. However, he didn't allow him to go beyond the kitchen. When James saw Frances, he asked if she had any money for bed, and she briefly looked up and muttered, "No," before drifting back to sleep. Frustrated, James accused her of spending the money he had given her on drink, and without a penny in his pocket, the watchman informed him that he couldn't stay the night without payment. So as he didn't have any money, James left. At 1 a.m, Frances suddenly woke up, and as she did not have enough money for her bed, she too had to leave the lodging house. She made her way to Shuttleworth's cafe on Wentworth Street, where she ordered some food. However, as she had nowhere to go, and it was very cold outside, once she had finished, she refused to leave. Eventually the young man who served her, named Joseph Haswell, persuaded her to go. As she wandered about, she met another woman who plied her trade on the streets of the East End, named Ellen Kalana. They spoke for a few moments, and as they did, a man wearing a cheese-cutter hat approached them and attempted to solicit Ellen. When she refused, he punched her in the face. He then turned his attention to Frances, who, despite the man's violent conduct towards her friend, decided to give him her attention, and they walked away together. At around 2:15 a.m, on what was now Friday the 13th of February 1891, Police Constable Ernest Thompson discovered a young woman lying in Swallow Gardens near the Royal Mint. She had been brutally attacked, with a deep cut across her throat, but to PC Thompson's shock, she was still alive. He immediately blew his whistle for backup, and a few minutes later, he was joined by Police Constable Elliott, who had been patrolling nearby. PC Thompson told him that he had passed through the area 15 minutes earlier, but when he returned he had heard footsteps fading into the distance, after which he looked into the dimly lit archway and noticed a figure lying on the ground. PC Hyde was next to arrive, and immediately left to find a doctor. Though the wait felt endless, Dr. Oxley arrived within a few minutes and confirmed that the young woman had died. By now word had spread that there had been a murder in Swallow Gardens, and more officers, including Inspector Flanagan, gathered there to see what exactly had happened. The inspector told his officers that the body should remain untouched. Shortly afterwards, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, examined the deceased woman and determined that the cause of death was a deep cut to her throat. Memories of the 1888 Jack the Ripper murders still lingered deeply in the minds of everyone in the East End, and indeed, all of London. The brutality of those infamous killings had left a lasting scar, and speculation quickly began to spread. Newspapers jumped on the notion that Jack may have returned, stoking fresh fears and intrigue before the woman's identity was even confirmed. As reports circulated, anxiety swept through the city, reviving the terrifying mystery of the faceless killer, who had haunted their streets only a few years earlier. Sergeant Edwards, who had been on duty at Tower Hill that night, reported that shortly after 2 a.m. he had noticed a man with blood-stained clothes who looked quite suspicious. When questioned, the man had claimed that he had been attacked, and given his dishevelled appearance, Sergeant Edwards said that he had accepted the story and let him go. However, when he heard about the murder, Sergeant Edwards reported his suspicions about this man, and a description was circulated. It was difficult for the police, as they did not know the name of the man they were looking for, or the name of the unfortunate woman who had been murdered. However, as the shocking news spread, a lady named Mrs. Fleming, who worked at the Spitalfields Chambers lodging house, wondered if the victim may be Miss Frances Coles. Deciding that she should try and find out, accompanied by her assistant, Florence Monk, she made her way to the Lemon Street police station. Once there, she was taken to the mortuary, and she was able to identify the victim as Miss Frances Coles. She also provided the police with a detailed description of the man she had seen at the lodging house. She said that he wore a cheese-cutter hat, a short blue jacket, a black silk handkerchief, blue serge trousers, and lace-up boots. Her account aligned with the information already reported by Sergeant Edwards. She told officers that the man arrived at the lodging house at about 3 a.m. in some distress. She said that he wanted to know if Miss Coles had returned, and claimed that he had been knocked down and kicked by a group of men near the highway. She added that after being told that he could not stay there, he was reluctant to leave, but eventually departed and headed in the direction of the London hospital. Mrs. Fleming then accompanied the officers in a search for the man, but they were unable to find him. She agreed to assist them again the following day, and they walked through the streets of Whitechapel and entered various beer houses. After hours of searching, Mrs. Fleming spotted the man in one such house. The officers approached him, and after a brief exchange, placed him under arrest. The man was then taken to Lemon Street Police Station for questioning, where on arrival, Sergeant Edwards confirmed that it was the individual he had encountered in the early hours of Friday, the 13th of February. The man told the officers that his name was James Thomas Sadler. He admitted to knowing Miss Coles, but denied any involvement in her death. Nevertheless, the police kept him locked up, and their inquiries continued. Several more witnesses came forward saying that they had seen Mr. Sadler in the company of the young woman on the night of her death. One witness even claimed that Mr. Sadler had previously lived with Miss Coles. Word quickly spread through the neighbourhoods that the prisoner was not only responsible for this horrible murder, but was also the infamous Jack the Ripper. The rumour incited an angry mob, which soon gathered outside the Lemon Street police station. To protect the suspect, officers tried to discreetly lead him out through a side exit, but the crowd spotted him, and shouts of murder echoed as the mob surged forward, determined to take justice into their own hands. In the chaos, police resorted to using their truncheons to defend the prisoner. However, the enraged crowd managed to land several blows, which left both police officers and James Sadler bloodied and bruised, before the officers finally regained control of the situation. On Sunday the 15th of February, the young woman who had been found in Swallow Gardens was formally identified by her father and her sister, who both confirmed that the victim was 31-year-old Frances Coles. The news of her identity was reported in all the papers, adding a human face to the tragedy and intensifying the city's fascination and fear. Following day, Mr. James Sadler was taken to the Thames Police Courts, where he was charged with the murder of Miss Frances Coles. Despite the great interest in the case, the court was closed to the public, disappointing the large crowd that had gathered outside. Mr. Sadler was dressed in a blue jacket, dark trousers, and sporting a dark beard and moustache. Entered the dock with his hands in his pockets. His face was dirty, with visible scratches on his cheeks. Superintendent Arnold informed the magistrates that only minimal evidence would be presented to support a remand, as requested by the public prosecutor. Samuel Harris, a fish curer, was the first witness. He had been staying at the lodging house in Spitalfields and testified that he knew the murdered woman and had seen her in the kitchen that night. Mr. Harris said that Mr. Sadler asked her if she had any money for a bed, but he did not hear her reply. He added that Mr. Sadler complained about being robbed, saying he would do for the person responsible. Mrs. Fleming and Florence Monk also provided testimony. The police court concluded that there was evidence against James Sadler on the charge of the murder of Frances Coles, and following this an inquest began, presided over by Mr. Baxter, James Sadler's account of that fateful night was consistent with what the witnesses had reported. He admitted to being with the deceased and had even discussed this openly in the local pubs before his arrest, but he firmly denied any involvement in her murder. He said that on Friday morning at 5 a.m. he had gone to the London hospital so his injuries could be treated, and staff there confirmed this. No one had seen him near Chambers Street or Swallow Gardens on Thursday night or Friday morning, and the last place he was spotted was Dock Street, which was about a mile away, where he claimed he was attacked and robbed. While giving his evidence, it was observed that his face was bruised and his hands were scratched. The court was told that he was a married man and had been away from London for 17 months. Workers from the Great Northern Railway, who had seen a man with the deceased woman in Royal Mint Street at 1:30 a.m, were unable to identify James Sadler as that man. Railway foreman Joseph Napton also failed to pick Mr. Sadler out when attending an identity parade. The police who attended the scene also gave evidence, but there were no witnesses who could positively place James Sadler at the scene of the crime. One crucial piece of testimony came from a man named Darren Campbell. He said that on Friday the 13th of February, he was staying at the Sailor's Home when around 10 a.m. a man came in saying he was weary and hungry and had been robbed. Mr. Campbell said that the man showed him a knife and asked if he would buy it. Mr. Campbell said he agreed, paid the man a shilling and gave him some tobacco. After that the man left, and Mr. Campbell said that he did not see him again. He went on to say that when he heard about the murder, he took out the knife and noticed that there was no blood on it, but the blade seemed to be damp. He said that he then washed it in clean water, wiped it off, and saw the water had turned slightly discoloured. He said that the next day he was short of money, so went to a shop owned by Mr. Robinson and borrowed sixpence against the knife. He then told the court that he kept on thinking about the murder, and after talking with some sailors, decided to go to the police and gave them a description of the man and took them to Mr. Robinson's shop. When Mr. Campbell was asked if he could identify the man, he pointed to the prisoner. Fortunately for Mr. Sadler, the Firemen's Guild had hired a skilled lawyer named Harry Wilson to support his case. Mr. Wilson mounted a robust defence. He highlighted witnesses' accounts that confirmed Mr. Sadler's claim of being attacked on the streets. He also secured testimony from boat captains who were familiar with the accused and could vouch for his hard-working nature, albeit with a tendency towards drink, but far removed from the profile of a killer. Additionally, Mrs. Sarah Sadler, his wife, provided statements to the police about her husband's generally good character, emphasising his history of peaceful conduct. The press were reporting every word, and they seemed to believe that James Sadler had not only murdered Francis Coles, but was also Jack the Ripper. The very thought that the notorious killer might finally be unmasked ignited a wave of fervent speculation, as people dared to hope that the identity of the elusive murderer would at last be revealed. However, the campaign grew so exaggerated that the British Interior Minister publicly voiced his displeasure in Parliament, criticising newspapers for pandering to the public's appetite for sensationalism. On Friday the 27th of February 1891, the inquest into Francis Cole's death came to a close. Coroner Baxter addressed the jury, noting that the case shared many similarities with previous murders, but emphasised it was up to the jury to decide whether they considered that James Sadler was responsible for the crime. After a long deliberation, they returned with a verdict. The foreman stood up and said, "We find that the deceased was wilfully murdered by some person or persons unknown, and we wish to state that we believe the police acted appropriately in detaining Mr. Sadler." James Thomas Sadler was then released, and as he left court he was cheered by a large crowd. Not everyone was satisfied with the verdict at Scotland Yard. There was an ongoing debate about James Sadler's involvement in Francis Cole's murder, despite the evidence suggesting that the knife used in the crime was blunt, similar to the one that Mr. Sadler had sold. Some, including Sir Melville Macnaghten, still held the belief that James Sadler was guilty. Others, however, pointed to the testimony of Sergeant Edwards and Sarah Fleming, who had both seen the accused man extremely drunk at around 2 and 3 a.m, making it unlikely that he was capable of committing the murder. Dr. Oxley's expert opinion further suggested that a man who was heavily intoxicated could not have produced the precise controlled movements necessary to inflict the fatal wound, especially with a blunt knife. It was later reported that Frederick Deeming, who had been captured in Australia in 1892 and claimed to be Jack the Ripper, had confessed to the murder of Francis Coles. However, when interviewed about it, it was clear that his account regarding the horrible crime wasn't accurate, and in October 1890 he had been sentenced to 9 months in prison in the city of Hull, which meant that on the day of the murder he was still being kept at Her Majesty's pleasure. Speculation continued that James Sadler was Jack the Ripper, despite him informing the police that on the 17th of August to the 1st of October 1888, which was when 4 of the 5 Jack the Ripper murders happened, he had been away at sea. Despite all the evidence, many still question whether he was in fact responsible for this horrible crime, and officially the murder of Miss Frances Coles in the early hours of Friday the 13th of February 1891 remains unsolved.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.